Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. We do a lot of contrast style painting over here, but today I want to go with a more traditional process. This Asurmen model has a lot of flat surfaces and overlapping details, and it will look a lot better if we use opaque paints instead of contrast for the base coats. We also have a set of recipe cards to go along with this video, and you can download them and print them out. Details about how to get them will be down in the description below. The first half of the video will be beginner friendly, and will cover the basics and paint the model to a battle-ready quality. In the second half, we'll spend a little more time and add some highlights. So let's grab our brushes and get started. After assembling the model, I mounted the parts to corks for easier handling, and then I undercoated it with gray primer. After the primer dried, I used my airbrush to spray the model all over with a standard white acrylic paint, diluted with water. Canned white sprays tend to have a rough texture, but the gray primer has a very smooth finish. It's a little extra work to prime this way, but I think the results are worth it. I began by base coating the armor with Calidor Sky Blue. Dilute the paint with about an equal amount of water, and apply a thin layer over the armor. After the first layer dries, paint a second for an opaque finish. You may need a third layer depending on how diluted your paint is. With a solid blue base coat on the armor, next I painted a layer of Asurmen blue contrast all over. Contrast paint isn't just for base coats. I think it works great as a shade as well. Work on one section at a time, and apply plenty of paint so it flows into all the recesses. Then use the brush to soak up any excess. I'd like to darken the shadows some more. I shaded the armor one more time with a mix of 1 part Drakenhof Nightshade and 2 parts Lamian Medium. If you want really deep shadows, you could paint full-strength Drakenhof Nightshade directly into the recesses. But I think this shade will be enough for me, so I'm going to stop here for now. Next I painted the helmet with Mephiston Red. Just like with the blue armor, I diluted the paint with water and built up a few layers for an opaque finish. I shaded the helmet next with Carroburg Crimson, and I used a sharp brush to line the paint directly into the recesses. Next I painted the inside of the cape with a base coat of Bonewhite. This paint can get kind of chunky if you don't thin it enough, so I like to thin it a little bit more than the other colors so it ends up smooth. I ended up painting about 3 layers for a solid finish. It can be kind of tricky to get the paint everywhere, and I think having the base unattached makes it easier to access these areas. Next I shaded the cape in 2 stages. First I painted the shadows with Xandri Dust. I'm not concerned with blending right now, I'm just thinking about the shadow shapes, and block those in with a couple layers of paint for a solid finish. Once the shapes are established, then I can blend out the edge with some glazing. Dilute Xandri Dust with about 2 parts water, and with barely any paint on the brush, build up some layers right along the edge. Notice how quickly the paint dries, because the brush has almost nothing on it. It's leaving a very thin, transparent film of paint on the surface, and we can create a blended effect by building up a few of these layers on top of each other. If you get a little carried away with glazing the Xandri Dust, or if you make a mistake, just go back with a glaze of Bonewhite from the other side. I like to go back and forth between the 2 colors. I think it makes the blend look smoother. Next I base coated the back of the cape with Corn Red, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second for an opaque finish. I shaded the cape next with a mix of about 1 part black and 3 parts Corn Red. Just like with the inside of the cape, don't worry about blending right away. Think about the shadow shapes and block in those shapes with opaque paint first. Once you're happy with the placement of the shadows, blend the edges with glazes. Apply a thin layer next to the shadow shape, and notice how quickly it dries. Keep building up a few layers, one on top of the other, until you're happy with the results. If you don't feel like blending the cape, you could forget the mix entirely and shade it with Nuln Oil instead. I also used the dark red mix to paint the helmet part of the banner. I base coated the white areas next with gray number 8 from my custom grayscale, and you can learn how to mix your own set in this video here. This is a really light gray that's almost white. It's basically a whole pot of white paint with a couple drops of black mixed in. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Corax White is close. Dilute the paint with water and build up 2 or 3 layers for a smooth, bright finish. I want this white to be really bright, and Apothecary White is a little too dark on its own. I mixed it with an equal amount of contrast medium and painted it all over like a shade. Next I painted the weapons, leather, and helmet plume with black paint. I want a solid, deep finish on the weapons, so I painted a second layer after the first one dried. While I had the black paint out, I used a really sharp brush and painted a narrow black line around the remaining details. This is a technique often called blacklining, and it will help give the model extra definition. I base coated the leather next with Rhinox hide, leaving a narrow black outline where it meets up against the other areas. Then I shaded the leather with Nuln Oil. I painted the sword handle and most of the remaining details with Runelord Brass, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second for a bright, solid finish. Then I shaded the brass with a layer of Targor Rage shade. I painted the remaining details on the weapons with Iron Hand steel. And then I shaded the steel with Griffcharger Gray. Let's quickly go over the colors I used on the banner. I painted the dark blue background with Cantor Blue. This color is fairly transparent, and you may need 3 layers for an opaque finish. I painted the other side of the banner with Lothern Blue. I shaded the dark blue side with Nuln Oil. And then I shaded the light blue side with Tyran Blue. Before I paint the next areas, I painted a narrow black outline around the shapes. I painted the stripes with Moon Yellow, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second for an opaque finish. Moon Yellow is a very opaque yellow, and you may even be able to get away with just 1 layer. Then I shaded the yellow stripes with Cassandora Yellow. I I painted the stars and moon shapes with Bonewhite, leaving a narrow black outline. Other than the sword, at this stage you could base the model and call it finished, but I'd like to add some highlights and extra details, so let's keep going. Speaking of the sword, let's work on that first. I mixed a really light blue color from about 2 parts white and 1 part Lothern blue, and I painted the blade. I think it's easier to just paint over the details at the bottom right now. It's too time consuming to try and avoid them, so I'm not going to worry about it now and I'll repaint it later. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for a solid finish. Next I blocked in the shadow shapes with Lothern blue. This is just like how I shaded the cape earlier, but on a smaller surface. Don't worry about blending right now, just establish where the shadows are first and we'll blend it later. Next I blended out the edges with glazes of Lothern blue. Dilute the paint with about 2 parts water, and with barely any paint on the brush, build up some thin layers along the edges of the shadow shapes. You can also go back to the lighter base coat mix and paint glazes with that. I find that going back and forth between the two colors will help make a smoother blend. I want to make the shadows just a little bit darker, so I shaded in the center of the blue shapes with a mix of Lothern blue and Cantor blue. Dilute the paint with plenty of water and have barely any paint on the brush. Acrylic paint will dry darker than it looks when it's wet, so start with a very thin layer first. You can always add more layers if you want it darker. Once I was happy with the blending on the sword, I painted a sharp line along the edges with pure white. I painted a narrow black line around the details at the base of the blade, and then touched up with Runelord Brass and Targor Rage Shade. Let's highlight the blue armor next, starting with a glaze of Calidor Sky Blue. Dilute the paint with about 2 parts water and apply anywhere the flat areas of the armor look too dark. I didn't end up glazing very much, so I moved on to edge highlights with less diluted blue paint. We want the first highlight to be wider than the next lines. A good rule of thumb is to take the sharpest line you can paint and double it. That way you'll have enough room for the next highlights to fit inside that line. If you make any mistakes, you can touch up the armor with a mix of Cantor Blue and Calidor Sky. It's not a perfect match, but it's close. The exact ratio will vary depending on how dark the previous layer is dried. I highlighted most of the edges next with a very sharp line of Lothern blue. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, please consider Patreon or a YouTube channel membership. We have some perks including a Discord server, printer-friendly PDF files of our new recipe cards, and early access to videos. Finally, I added a few dot highlights on the sharpest edges and corners with the light blue mix I made earlier for the sword. I think it's easy to overdo this highlight, so I like to add it sparingly, and I tend to focus mostly on the top facing areas. I also used that mix to highlight the light blue part of the banner. Next I highlighted the Bonewhite areas with Offwhite. Dilute it with water, and with barely anything on the brush, paint a transparent edge highlight, a little wider than you want at first. Since the paint is diluted, it's slightly transparent and some of the base coat color will show through. After the first line dries, paint another line inside it. This line will look a little brighter than the first, and you'll effectively get a gradient highlight without having to mix anything. I highlighted the red part of the banner next with corn red. I want this red to look dark, so I'm keeping the edge highlight narrow. I mixed a small amount of toxic yellow into the corn red and added a sharper highlight on the edges. I had yellow on my palette already, but you could mix in any light color and it should work fine. If you don't feel like mixing anything, you could use a lighter color like Bugman's Glow or Pink Horror. I highlighted the edges of the yellow stripes next with toxic yellow. And then I highlighted the dark blue areas of the banner with the Fang Gray. Followed by a sharp line of Rust Gray. Next I highlighted the white areas with pure white. I like the white paint from Vallejo Game Color, but any brand will work fine. Do you have a favorite brand of white paint? Share it down in the comments below. I want the cape to be a darker red than the helmet. I highlighted the edges with a very sharp line of Mephiston red. You could blend it with glazes if you want, but I'm just going to paint a sharp line. I like the stylized look of the sharp lines. Then I highlighted one more time with an even sharper line of Jokero orange. Since the helmet is going to have some really bright highlights, I want the cape to have more muted highlights. Moving on to the helmet next. For the first highlight, I painted a wide line on most of the edges with Evil Sun Scarlet. Next, I painted a sharper highlight with Wild Rider Red. Finally, I added a very narrow line of Fire Dragon Orange on the sharpest edges and corners. I highlighted the leather next with an edge highlight of Blood Reaver flesh. I highlighted the leather one more time with Steel Legion Drab. I don't want the leather to detract from the armor, so I'm going for more of a subtle highlight rather than a very bright color. Next I picked out the edges of the steel with Stormhost Silver. I want the black to have a neutral gray highlight, and I painted the edges with gray number 2 from my custom grayscale. If you don't feel like mixing anything, you could use Eshin Gray instead. I highlighted the black areas one more time with a really sharp line of gray number 5 from my custom grayscale. And if you don't feel like mixing anything, you could use Administratum Gray instead. Next I highlighted the brass with Canoptic Alloy. Over a black undercoat, I base coated the pink gems with Emperor's Children pink, leaving a narrow black outline. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for an opaque finish. Then I shaded the gem all over with Magos purple, allowing more of the paint to accumulate on the top half. Next I shaded the top portion with Sigvald Burgundy. You could paint a second layer if you want the shadows to be darker. I painted a narrow crescent-shaped highlight along the bottom with a mix of equal parts white and Emperor's Children pink. And then I added a white dot highlight in the corner. Over a black undercoat, I base coated the bright green gems with Moon Yellow, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second for an opaque finish. Next I shaded the gem all over with Karandras green, and allowed more of the paint to pool on the top half. Then I shaded the top half with Orc Flesh contrast paint. If the Orc Flesh paint is too strong, you could dilute it with some Karandras green. Then I added a white dot in the corner. If you're really confident with a brush, you can add some freehand to the cloth with corn red and black paint. I won't have enough time to go over the process in this video, but let me know down in the comments if you'd like to see a video about painting freehand. With all the painting done, I clipped off the pins and then assembled the model with super glue. I used an old brush to apply a generous amount of wood glue to the top of the base, and then I sprinkled on some coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted the sand with thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a heavy dry brush of Mournfang brown, a lighter dry brush of Balor brown, and then a very light dry brush of Bonewhite. I painted the rubble with Dawnstone, and then I painted this section of text with Xandri dust. I shaded the stone with a mix of equal parts Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade, and after that dried, I dry brushed all the stone with a mix of Dawnstone and Bonewhite. The stone looked a little too light, so I added one more layer of shade to darken it. I painted the vines with a mix of Castellan green and black, and then I highlighted the vines with Castellan green. I painted the edge of the base with Mournfang brown, and after that dried, I added patches of static grass with super glue. I'd like to give a big shout out to our supporters here on YouTube and Patreon. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below or follow the Patreon link in the video description. Thank you. Eldar have to be one of my favorite armies to paint. I really like the variety of bright colors throughout the army. Each model is a little different and it keeps things interesting. Do you like having a wide variety of colors in your army, or do you prefer to limit the number of colors? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.